I'm Kendra from Redgate. In this video, I'm going to talk about drift reports in SQL Change Automation, and also a new option that lets you fine-tune what you see in that drift report. I'm going to talk about a few topics along the way. First, we're just going to talk about what is database drift and what is the drift report in SQL Change Automation. We will talk about who this is useful for, how the drift report is implemented, and we'll also dig into a demo there. So first up, what is drift in the context of database development and deployment? Well, you can have drift in database environments in a couple different ways. Let's say that I've got a production environment and also some development environments as well, and I have my development databases in version control, and I have processes to validate and deploy code from version control to production, right? So anything that gets deployed to that database using that process of going into version control and then getting deployed through that, that is expected, right? That is in line. That is not drift. But periodically, I might sometimes have a change that happens to that production database that didn't start in version control and did not flow through that process. Maybe it's because there was an emergency and people needed to fix something right away and they didn't use the process. Either they didn't know how to use the process or a decision was made for some reason to just make the change directly to the production database. That production database has now drifted from source control. It has things that happened to it that didn't flow through that process. Now we can bring it back in line. We can take the changes that happen to production. We can check them into version control and we can ensure they get deployed everywhere else in our pipeline, right? So we can bring that drift back in line. Or maybe it was an accident that those changes were made to production, right? Maybe somebody thought they were connected to a different database. In that case, we might revert the drift and make changes to that production database to say, oh, get rid of that drift and make it match what's in source control. Those were not intended to be kept, those changes, right? And in the very worst case, if those accidental changes cause data loss, not only might we need to revert the changes to the schema, but we might also need to restore a backup of data from before the mistake was made and refresh the data in there as well. Now, drift can happen in other databases as well. Let's say we have a QA database where 3 different teams share the same QA database. This isn't an ideal world, right? In an ideal world, teams can create QA databases on the fly in a lightweight fashion and keep them updated and synchronized with where they are in version control and what they expect the deployment order to be for pending changes. But lots of people don't live in the ideal world. Lots of people may have long-lived QA databases, and maybe another team makes a bunch of changes to database objects as they're testing something in QA and they forget to undo them and they forget to check them into version control. That database has now drifted from version control. So if my team is now going to be using that environment, having something like a drift report to warn us that it's different is very, very useful to us. And similarly with production as well. Before you do a production deployment, has that thing drifted? Really, really useful to know. And so a drift report is created by SQL Change Automation as part of this process of creating a release artifact. When you're doing deployments with SQL Change Automation, at first you do a build early in the development process, and the build outputs a build artifact. And then you can use that build artifact. You can say, okay, let's look at this build artifact, and then let's look at that database I want to deploy to, and let's create a release artifact that compares what's going to happen, the deployment changes that are going to happen in that build artifact with the database, and tell me what changes you're going to make to the database, but also tell me if that database has drifted. And this is an image of, if you look at the file name at the top of the script here, notice that it says drift.html at the top of the page. And we're looking at the list of things that have drifted, comparing my build artifact to a database that I want to deploy to. And this one says there's 2 objects that have been modified in this drift report, and I've expanded the details on the orders table. So for example, on the orders table, we can see that extra column in deploy database table is a column that has been added in that database. It has drifted, and version control doesn't know about that column at all. So that is what a drift report is. And in addition to creating that, the HTML list here, this is an overview to help you understand, okay, what is this drift? In addition to that, SQL Change Automation also creates a script that you can use in the case that you want to revert that change. So if you evaluate that change and you realize, oh, this is something that we just want to undo, this revert script for the drift can be run if it's appropriate to say, no, we want to get that database back in line with where version control thinks this should be before we do our deployment. So the drift report script can be useful for that as well. So who is this most useful for? Well, as I mentioned, if we have long-lived databases, so if we have a situation where we have shared environments for development, for test, and we don't have the ability to create these on the fly, we don't have the ability to reset these very often, a general rule is just that the longer an environment exists, the longer it can drift from version control. So it is especially useful in these long-lived environments to have drift reporting functionality and to check it regularly as part of your deployment process, just to make sure that the state of the database that you're deploying to is what version control thinks it should be. Because if we have, different databases in our development and testing processes, and they're all in different states, and we don't pay attention to that, how do we know what's going to happen when we deploy to production, right? How do we know that it was anything at all like the other environments that we tested in? But even if we actually have kind of harnessed the powers of technology in a clever way, so let's say we've got a SAN snapshotting technology or something like Redgate's SQL clone that lets us very quickly create development and test environments. This is great because it means I don't have to use a long-lived QA environment. I can say, okay, I'm going to quickly create a new environment for testing this based on a snapshot of our production database that maybe has had sensitive data masked and redacted in it if we're also using masking, right? So I'm going to very quickly create a new QA environment. Even in that case, which is great, it is possible that drift has happened in production that is the source of that snapshot, right? Either due to an emergency fix, to an accident, right? Being able to detect that drift is also still important in this more infrastructure as code, more agile model as well. Although there's less opportunities for the drift to happen, in a long-lived QA environment, it's still a possibility as well. So this having a drift report is, I think, a generally useful thing to anyone who wants to have quality database changes and be able to move pretty quickly in that cycle. Here is a little bit about how the drift report works in SQL Change Automation. This is a little bit fancy, and I think it can be helpful to understand how this works. In the build process, when you build a project in SQL Change Automation, you're doing a few things. And I've just got some highlights on this. This is not an exhaustive list on this slide. In the build, we validate the code in the project, right? Including whatever you have in pre-deployment, post-deployment scripts, as well as the project code itself. And to do this, it deploys the code against a database. It can either create a new database for the build, or it can reuse an existing database, and it does clean that database out if it's reusing a database. At the end of this process, it takes a snapshot of what that schema of the database looks like at the end of the build. So what should the schema look like at the end of this deployment? And this snapshot can be it is very, very useful for the purposes of reporting on changes and reporting on drift. And that snapshot is produced as part of the build artifact as well as the code in the project. Now that build artifact, which is a NuGet package, that's just how the artifact's implemented from SQL Change Automation. It's called a NuGet package. When you are ready to deploy to a database, you tell it, okay, here is the build that I want to deploy to that database. And on the very first deployment, it won't be able to create a drift report. And this is just the very first deployment for a pipeline. So we typically recommend that when you're first setting up an initial pipeline for the database, you don't want to deploy a whole lot of changes on your very first deployment through the pipeline. You really want your first deployments through the pipeline to be more like a hello world. This is useful for a few reasons. I mean, first of all, when you're first setting something up, you really want to just validate. Do I have the permission set up? Do I have the wrist bone connected to the whatever bone? Like, is everything functioning fine? You don't want to also be worrying about deploying a bunch of changes in there. But also, on that very first deployment through the pipeline, when you first deploy a release artifact, that is when it stores the snapshot of the build in that target database, right? So the build captures what should the schema look like at the end of this deployment, right? So at the end of every deployment, we capture in the database, oh, by the way, so we deploy the code to the database, but then also we keep a record of, here's a snapshot of what the code should look like in this schema according to the project, right? So this is very, very useful, though, that it comes from the project. One question that might come up is, well, why wouldn't you just take a schema snapshot of the database you are deploying to itself? Well, I actually think, I'm not the person who originally designed this feature, but when I'm thinking about this, I think it's very, very useful that we take the snapshot at the build step, because that shows here is the state expected by version control. If I'm running a deployment to a QA database, there is actually a chance that someone else, my colleague, Steve, he could also be making changes to that QA database while I'm doing the deployment, right? I might deploy a change to the employees table, and right after I'm done, like in the middle of my deployment still going on, but I'm done making changes to that table, he could actually make another change to that table. Nothing is stopping him from that. We are not taking out, unless you make it, we do not take out an exclusive lock on the database because concurrency is important, right? If we just snapshotted the database that you're deploying to, which is, it can be a shared database environment, that's totally fine. We might get things in that snapshot that are not what you have in source control. So I think that capturing that snapshot of the desired state of the database and the build stage, where a private database is being used for the build, that actually really does have validity, and it really makes sense to me after it took me sort of thinking through this for a while. But what this pattern means is after that first deployment is complete, right, and that first real deployment through the pipeline, we really just want to be like, hey, did the deployment work? We're going to make, a meaningful change on the second deployment through. When we're doing our second, our third, any deployment after that, at the point where we create the release artifact, we can compare the snapshot we've got from the build we want to deploy with the snapshot in the target database that represents the target state. And that comparison will tell us what are the changes we can deploy. We can also compare the snapshot in the target database that represents here's what we expect the state of the database to be. We can compare that to what is the state of the actual database to see what has drifted. So moving this snapshot throughout the process is really, really useful for telling what changes are going to be in the deployment and capturing drift from the deployment. So that's a little bit about how the internals of this works. You don't have to memorize that or anything, but when thinking through this, sometimes I think it can be useful to understand that. Now you do have a few options to configure the drift report. And most folks want to use the default option. So usually you don't have to change this, but some folks do want to customize this. So this can be useful. When you are checking, has this database drifted, what most folks want is this option that's called ModifiedObjectsOnly. When you're creating the release artifact, you say, I want to know about drift only for objects that I have in my SQL Change Automation project. So in other words, if an extra stored procedure exists in the target database, but it's not in my project, don't count that as drift. If there is an extra table in the target database or an extra user or an extra function, but I don't know about it in my project, just don't count that as drift. Just ignore it. Let it be there. Don't drop it. And this is the default option because for a lot of folks, they may have users in the production environment that are not in the dev environment, and they really don't want the drift report seeing those as drift or suggesting that they be dropped. Or perhaps they have certain objects that the database administration team, maybe they add, a popular stored procedure like SP who is active by Atom Mechanic. Maybe they have that in the production databases, but it's not really checked into source. It's not really part of the database, and they don't want that considered as drift. They don't want it dropped. Now you do have the option to create a filter on your project and filter these things out and ignore them. But most users have told us, just worry about drift for the objects that we have in the project and ignore everything else, right? So that's why that default is there. If you do want to report on drift for everything, if you think, and this is totally fair, this is really just a question of how you run your databases. If your perspective is that things should either be filtered out, and if they aren't filtered out, they should be counted as drift, then you can set, when you're creating your release artifact, you can set your drift filter to all objects. And setting this to all objects says, if there are extra objects in the database which are not excluded by a filter or something similar in our compare objects, do count those as drift, right? If it's in the database, it should be in version control unless we have filtered it out. Now there's a third option, and this one is new. This one is objects to be updated only. And this one says, I only care about drifts, or I only care about drift on objects that we are modifying in this deployment. So this is the most limited drift option. And this one is going to be useful. Most likely the case for when this one's useful is if you've got long-lived environments, like a long-lived QA environment, and you do have multiple teams working in there. And each team, when they deploy, there might be, maybe there's 10,000 objects in our project, right? There may be a bunch of other people working on a lot of those objects, but we're only changing 3 objects in our next deployment. We only want to know if drift has happened on those 3 objects. In that case, in order to give you a simpler drift report for that complex scenario, then you would want the objects to be updated only on your drift report. Now, the nice thing is, this is an option that you set when you are creating a release artifact. It's not like a property of your project, right? So it's not like you can only use one of these. If you have a pipeline, you could use a different option when you're deploying to your QA environment than you might use when you're deploying to your production environment, right? Maybe when you're deploying to production, you would want to review all objects or modified objects only, but on a different environment, you would want to be more focused. Since this option is on the create release artifact commandlet, then you have that option to do different things throughout your pipeline. One note on objects to be updated only. You do need to be aware that it really only looks at the objects you're updating and it does not check all their dependencies. So in other words, if I'm deploying a change to a view and drift has happened on a table, which is referenced by that view, it will not report that to me. It will only report drift to me regarding the exact objects which I am modifying in my project. All right, so let's take a look at this in a demo. So this isn't a real demo right away. I first wanted to just show you that the documentation is here to help. I actually think we have really great documentation at Redgate. This is the PowerShell commandlet documentation for New-DatabaseReleaseArtifact, and you can see here is the drift filtering object here, and it goes through and defines what all of those, I just covered these 3 options, and it talks about what the default setting is for this, and it notes that this setting is applicable to SQL Change Automation projects only. In other words, this is if you are authoring the changes in SQL Change Automation, not if you are authoring changes in SQL Source Control. That is what this is all about. So let us look at a demo here. And this demo is going to be really just looking at examples of the artifacts. So I have a build here, and let's go ahead and for funsies, just go ahead and do a new build. These build scripts are based upon our project documentation, and I just have them referring to a project that I have this checked in VS Code in the same folder as my SQL Change Automation project. So they're just detecting what the root folder is and finding the project in this folder. And I'm telling it where to put the build artifact as it's done. So go ahead and run this. It first invokes the build, and I tell it where my SQL server is to use the build and make the database, and then it creates that NuGet package, that build artifact, and exports it to the file system. So this creates that snapshot as well as does that validation, and it exported my artifact to my local file system. You know, in reality, I'd probably be doing this on a build server, but I'm just doing this locally here for demo purposes. So over here in my release script, I'm going to tell it I want the build.003, telling it where to pick it up from, and I'm telling it where to create my release artifact as well. And I'm also telling it, this is just my local SQL Server instance, what's the database that we're going to deploy to? So we're going to create a release artifact to tell us what changes will be deployed to drift report deploy, as well as what drift looks like it's happened on drift report deploy. And just for demo purposes, I am connecting to the SQL server. I'm creating a new release artifact, and then I'm exporting the release artifact, but I have commented out the actual deployment. I'm not actually deploying the release artifact. I'm simulating a case where I would just want to review the release artifact, and I'm going to create the release artifact in a couple of different ways. So it's useful for me to be able to run it a couple times. So I'm doing the what would happen if I released, but I'm not actually releasing. Now in my database that is my deployment database here, I've done a couple of things. I've created drift in a couple of different ways because I want to show you the different flavors of drift report. So one thing I did is I added an extra table that is not in my project. The table is called extra table not in project. So in the default mode that we run this in, it's not going to pick this up, right? Because the default flavor of the drift report only looks for drift at items that are actually defined in the project. I also I've modified one table that is in the project. It is the employees table. I added an extra column to the employees table. You may remember this from the screenshot. And then there's another table named orders that I've also added an extra column in. And the difference is, for For the employees table, I have generated a migration in SQL Change Automation where I'm saying, oh, I want to add a column to the employees table. Right, so there's that one flavor of drift report that says, I only care about things I'm modifying in this deployment. The employees table is the only table that I'm modifying in my most recent deployment. So this will help us see the differences in the three styles of the build report. So let's start out here. The first way I'm going to do this, I'll save my script. When we create a new release artifact, we pass in the drift filtering option. So the first option I'm going to pass in is actually the default option. So I could just leave this off and it would go with the default. That is ModifiedObjectsOnly. So I'm going to go ahead and run this script, and it will look at the target database. And that was quite fast. And it does warn me here, drift report resync has been generated here. So let's take a look at our artifact that was generated here. This is for the 003 build, so I told it to create it with this name. We can see that we have our drift report script there. Let's go into the reports first. So we have Changes.html. That is what changes will be deployed when I deploy this to the database. There's also a .json file of changes. And this can be useful. The HTML is, of course, useful for human consumption and analysis. The JSON one can be useful for automation purposes. Maybe you want to connect this to a change management system, do other things like that. That file might be useful there. And then we have the drift.html report. So let's open that drift.html report. So under the default flavor of drift report, it doesn't care about anything in the database that isn't in the project, right? So that extra table I added to the database is not in here. But both objects that I modified in the database are included in the drift report, whether they're going to be changed in the deployment or not. So the employees table says extra column in deploy DB table is there. And the orders table says extra column in deploy DB table is there, because I named the column the same thing on both tables. So that default flavor of the report, everything that's in the project, whether I am making a change to it in the deployment or not, will be checked for drift in the drift report. Go ahead and close this out. And if I go up one level, I can look also at that drift revert script. And going down here to our drift report script, it considers both of those tables. All right, so what if I use a different option here? Let's go ahead and go up a level here, and I just don't want Windows to have to worry about that being there, so we'll delete that drift report. And let's go ahead and make this all objects. What if we want it to include all objects in the drift report? Let's go ahead and just say, okay, do a different flavor of our drift report. It is all done. Our release artifact has been recreated. If I go in now to my drift report, now that I've said include extra objects, basically like whether or not the object is in my SQL Change Automation project, do you consider it for drift? Now, extra table not in project shows up in addition to our friends who we saw before. And we can see also the definition of extra table not in project. So that, including all objects there, changes that behavior. And now if I go into my drift report script here, we can see that, zooming in a little bit, now and this is an important thing to understand, right? Because this extra table in here, it's like, oh, if you want to correct this drift, we are going to actually drop this table. So if that's what you want, that's very, very useful, but it's just you want to understand that before you go all in and use that option, or you want to review it really carefully, essentially, right? And then our third and final option is this new one, objects to be updated only. So this one, go ahead and press play here. This one will only consider, it will only care about drift on objects that I am modifying in my deployment. And that is only that one table, right? So now if we go in and we look at the release artifact here, drift.html. Oh, it's the, I am modifying the employees table. The employees change table is the only thing now that is included in our drift report. And similarly, if we look at our drift revert script, it is, there's the pre-deployment script. Here we go. Begin drift correction script. Yes, it only this time actually corrects that one table. So those are the 3 different flavors of it. We do have these all documented online. So if you don't remember exactly how this works, just check online at our documentation on correcting drift in SQL Change Automation. And I'll also link to that documentation page in the video notes. Thanks for watching this video on how drift reports work in SQL Change Automation. I'll talk to you again in another video soon. Bye, folks.